Okay, so as you know, we got off a week. So what I have done, and I know that this is going to be very upsetting for many of you, but we are going to do all of the rest of the Old Testament right now. And we're going to be done with it. Well, I already did it Sunday, so I know I can do it. And listen, I'm going to go ahead and tell you, when we get to the end, we're going to go over a few books, and I'm going to read summaries from John Walton and Andrew Hill's, they're little short things, survey of the Old Testament, and then we're going to be done, okay? And so that means next Wednesday, you will be back on where we will be in the middle of the week when we come here. You will be hearing about that whole week's worth of stuff, right? So like we were before, right before the deal happened. So, in finishing up, and that doesn't mean we're going to like shoot through everything, because we have several things that we're going to talk about in Daniel still that we're going to get through, and then some of the other stuff we will hit. But this will kind of continue and finish our Daniel conversation when we talked about Greece as the final empire and all of that. But it's not going to be quite as complicated. There is something that's going to be really odd that we're going to talk about, but we'll get to that right here at the first. Okay, so Daniel 10. So in Daniel 10, starting at verse 1, it says, in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a word was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar. And the word was true, and it was a great conflict. And he understood the word and had understanding of the vision. In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks. I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for the full 3 weeks. On the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris, I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude. Okay, so note that what you have here is you have Daniel gets a vision, and then he's going to have a vision, okay? And this right here, and we'll talk about all of the characters that we're about to meet, but it would seem most likely that what he's having now is a theophany, right? So a theophany, notice it's theo, right? So that's going to be an appearance or he's coming into contact with God, right? So a theophany, right? A Christophany is if you come into contact with Christ, right? And then an angelophany, just for the record, is self-explanatory. And so we're gonna potentially be dealing with a theophany and a angelophany, if you will. Okay. Note that the descriptions of the man that he comes into contact with here are very similar to those describing divine beings in Ezekiel, right? So there's very similar descriptions. So, and you don't have to try to go to these, because I'll do one at a time, right? There's just each one verse from each place. It says, and behold, 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate. Ezekiel 9:2. And behold, 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north, each with his weapon for slaughter in his hand, and with them was a man clothed in linen. Notice a man clothed in linen, with a writing case at his waist, and they went in and stood beside the bronze altar. Ezekiel 1:13, so you got a man in linen there. Ezekiel 1:13 says, as for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches moving to and fro among the living creatures. And the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning. So again, you have this whole idea of fire here. At 1:16, as for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl. And if you'll remember, these describe the creatures that made up the throne of God, if you will, the fiery chariot throne of God. And the 4 had the same likeness, their appearance and construction being as it were a wheel within a wheel. Ezekiel 1:23 says, and under the expanse their wings were stretched out straight, one toward another, and each creature had 2 wings covering its body. Ezekiel 1:7 says, their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Right? So note that you do have these descriptions that are very similar to the description of what we get in Daniel 10, 5 through 6, right? And it is described as a man clothed in linen, and then he has all these other descriptions. And we know that the man clothed in linen in Ezekiel did not seem to be God himself, right? It seemed to be another divine being who was symbolically measuring out the area for the temple and all of that. So then Daniel continues on at 10, 9 through 12. It says, then I heard the sound of his words, and as I heard the sound of his words, I fell on my face in deep sleep with my face to the ground. And behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. So what we have to decide first is if, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail, I'll just kind of tell you what seems to be most likely to me. But so what we need to deal with first is the person that he saw, or the man in linen, is that the same being, if you will, who just touched him on the shoulder, right? So it's like, are we talking 2 different characters here, or is it the same character? And he said to me at verse 11, O Daniel, man greatly loved, understand the words that I speak to you, and stand upright, for now I have been sent to you. And then and when he has spoken this word to me, I stood up trembling. Then he said to me, fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words. All right, so again, are there 2 beings that we've met, or is there just one, right? If there are 2, it seems somewhat more likely that the first is a theophany. So you see God, he sees God, and then it's an angel who touches him on the shoulder, right? And it's the one who needs help fighting against the prince of Persia, which we will then read about here in a minute, okay? So it doesn't seem likely that that character is either God or Jesus. Sometimes people will say, well, that's the angel of the Lord, which would, be God in human form. And so then that angel of the Lord then speaks about the fact that he needs help against the prince of Persia. Well, if it's God, then it doesn't seem like he would need help, right? If they're both the same being, just for the record, then it seems likely that it's just an angel who he sees, and he sees the angel in the spectacular appearance, and then he passes out, and then the angel comes and touches him and then tells him things that are going on. So then you get to Daniel 10, 13 through 14, which is where it really gets weird, right? So you're like, well, it was already kind of weird. Well, buckle up. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. Okay, so now if I read the prince of the kingdom of Persia, all right, some of you might remember a video game. Just kidding, most of you would not. You might. The Prince of Persia, right, was a famous video game that people played. I mean, I played it, I'm just going to say. And so, but if you think of the prince of the kingdom of Persia, what do we think? It's a king or whatever, right? It's some human character, right? But Michael, who is Michael? Angel. He's an angel, right? We know that. One of the chief princes came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia, right? And came to make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days. For the vision is for days yet to come. So we have to ask ourselves, who is this who is this prince of the kingdom of Persia? Well, we know that Michael is an angel, and if Michael is one of the chief princes, then it would seem that this prince of the kingdom of Persia would also be an angel or a divine being, right? Note, continuing at 10, 20 through 21, so it skips a little bit that didn't really have anything to do with that. It says, Then he said, do you know why I have come to you? But now I will return to fight against the prince of Persia, And when I go out, behold, the prince of Greece will come. But I will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. There is none who contends by my side against these except Michael, your prince. Okay, so Michael seems to be associated as the prince of Israel, right? Then you have the prince of Persia, and you have the prince of Greece that it at least describes. So I'm going to tell you what it seems to be saying, and then I'm going to let you see it, all right, in other parts of the Bible where it seems to indicate that. It would seem that what is being envisioned here, at least, is that each of these world empires has a divine being set up over it. But those divine beings seem to be evil, right? And so they fight against God's people and against Israel. And so what it would seem like is, and you see it in other places, you certainly see it, for instance, in Revelation 12, and we've talked about this in the past, but that's the famous vision of the woman clothed with the sun and the moon and the stars, or the moon and the stars. And then the dragon comes, and we're told that the dragon is clearly Satan, and it's coming after the woman who gives birth to a child. That's clearly the Messiah. All of that is obviously very symbolic. But then you get to verse 7 in Revelation 12, and then it gives you the same story, but from a heavenly perspective. And it says Michael is fighting against the powers of Satan in the divine world. And so what it's doing is it's saying, look, while all this stuff is playing out with Jesus and all of this on earth, and he's being, they're trying to get him, and then they eventually crucify him and all that. Well, while that's going on, in the spiritual or divine realm, you have a parallel of stuff going on. So what seems to be being said here is that while you have these earthly powers fighting against God's people and each other, well, what's happening is in the same time that you have that happening, you have a divine counterpart of that battle happening where you have the spiritual world is also at war, right? And so, listen, does that sound crazy? Yeah, it does sound crazy, right? And I'll tell you where I first, read it through all this. My Hebrew professor, who I've talked about in the past, Mike Heiser, he wrote a book called The Unseen Realm. And we talked about Psalm 82 at one point in time. But in Psalm 82, it clearly states that God holds counsel amongst the gods. Again, we're not saying that there are other actual gods that are at the same level as Yahweh. But what we are saying is that God creates divine beings, and then he puts those divine beings, angels, if you will, to work doing certain things. And it says in Psalm 82 that he is judging amongst them, and then he tells them, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing for your people. And some translations, particularly like the King James, will change it to humans or kings because they're like, well, they can't be. But the word is clearly God's. It's Elohim is the Hebrew word. And it clearly says God has his counsel amongst the gods and he judges them, right? So this seems to be the same thing. So where would these divine beings have come from? How do they get associated with the nations? It would seem again that God separated out these divine beings over those ancient nations for whatever reason or however that works. And it states it in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9. It says, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. Now, if you have a King James Version or a New King James Version, it doesn't say that he divided out the nations based on the sons of God. It says the sons of Israel, right? Why is that? Because remember when we talked about texts of the Old Testament, we talked about the Septuagint, which I'll just give you, it's old and Greek. You have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are old and in Hebrew and Aramaic, that's the best. And then you have the newer Masoretic text, which is like 1,800 to 1,000 years after Jesus. Those are the texts that I'm going to use to translate the Old Testament. Well, in the past, they would defer more, before they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they would defer more toward the Masoretic text. And that's what the King James Version uses, right? Well, in the Masoretic text, which again is way later, it says sons of Israel. But in the Septuagint, which they had there, the Greek translation of the Old Testament that the New Testament writers used as their Bible, that Greek Septuagint had sons of God. But people looked and they said, I don't know, that sounds weird. Sons of Israel just doesn't sound as weird, but it doesn't make any sense that God would have divided up based on the sons of Israel before the sons of Israel even existed. And so what they will say is that the Israel just sounded better. And so then you get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are found in 1947. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls also say sons of God. And we know from previous stuff that sons of God means almost always, I think there's one instance where it's not, sons of God means angels, right, in the Old Testament. And so right there, it's saying that he divided up the nations based upon the sons of God that are apparently put over those nations. And then it says clearly, but the Lord's portion is his people. So he takes Israel and apparently puts Michael in charge there, but Israel is his people. These other divine beings are over, or angels, however you want to look at it, are over the other nations. And at some point in time, those angels seem to have gone bad. Note that Isaiah seems to speak of the punishment of both the evil world empires and, in terms of both the earthly king as well as the heavenly counterpart. So in Isaiah 24, 21 through 23, it says, on that day, the Lord will punish the host of heaven, which is divine beings in heaven, and the kings of the earth on the earth. So both will be punished, both the kings of earth and the divine beings. They will be gathered together as prisoners in a pit. They will be shut up in a prison, and after many days they will be punished. The moon will be confounded and the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts reigns on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and his glory will be before his elders. Note, too, that Paul has the same understanding. So in 1 Corinthians, that's not right. Oh, yeah, it is. I'm sorry. In 1 Corinthians 10, 14 through 20, Paul says this. He says, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? So am I saying that this food offered to idols is going anywhere, or that the idols mean anything? No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. So Paul seems to think the same thing, that when the pagan worshipers are worshiping, and we look at it and we say, well, there's only one God, obviously. And just for the record, there is only one God at that level. But we say clearly there are other pagan gods that are real. But Paul seems to say that there is something behind them, and he calls them demons, right? And so if you think of fallen angels as demons, otherwise, where do demons come from? Then that would make sense, and that would be a logical thing, and it seems that Paul backs up that same idea. So again, the point seems to be that things that are happening on earth have a spiritual parallel that's also going on in the spirit world. And listen, I'm just telling you what it seems like it says, okay, and what it seems like they understood. As I read through Mike Heiser's book, every time I would get to a new chapter and I would read his first, introduction to where he talked about what he was going to say, I would say, that's just crazy talk. That does not make any sense. And then as I read through all his arguments, I would be like, well, that's exactly what it says. Like, it says exactly that. Like in these passages that I just read from, that seems to be their understanding, right? And so as I read through his book, I was like, no, that can't be. And then I was like, that's what it says. And then I was like, no, that can't be. That seems to be what it says. Again, your other argument would be something like God is just, describing things in ways that they understood. They believed that there were these other gods or whatever. But again, when it talks about in Psalm 82 that he's judging amongst these other gods, which again, I am not saying, and do not go and quote me saying that Joe says there's other gods. I'm just saying that there are divine beings created by God that he's put to work in different tasks. And we've read those tasks in the past when they get Ahab killed and all kinds of different things. It seems to be that there is something there that has to do with these divine beings that have been set over these nations. And Daniel talks about it. Paul seems to be talking about it. It seems to be a fairly widespread understanding. All right. Daniel 11. If you remember as you read through this, because I'm sure y'all all have memorized it and you just remember all of what it was about. Listen, let me just say, Daniel 11 is about things that were going to happen in the 2nd century BC. Okay, so it's about the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Remember, we talked about Antiochus the Fourth. He's the little horn in Daniel 9. And so he's the one that's being talked about. And this Daniel 11 is so clearly talking about the events of the 2nd century BC that critical scholars will look and say Daniel wrote so well about that historical period that he had to have been writing after they happened, right? And so that's the difference, is that you have traditional scholars who will say, well, the events happened in, say 539 or whatever BC, right around there. And then critical scholars will say, no, he was too close. There's no chance that God told him that these events happened. So it had to have been he wrote after the 2nd century, after these events happened. And so obviously as a conservative, we believe that God can tell people the future, right? And so, but I would argue clearly that God is telling them the future, not about necessarily, particularly in chapter 11, these aren't necessarily things that are happening in our future yet. They're things that ended in the 2nd century right there. However, some will argue that in chapter 11, when it clearly talks about Antiochus IV, that there is a transition then made where it transitions over to talking about a future Antichrist. But as one scholar who is conservative, Tremper Longman states, he says this. He says, the reading below, and he's talking about his commentary, and in this chapter, he's going to assume that it does transition and talk about a future Antichrist figure. He says, the reading below assumes that Daniel 11 is actual prophecy, which I also assume. However, I admit up front that the explanation given for the transition from Antiochus IV to a future Antichrist figure is not a particularly strong one. In short, there are no clear textual signals that there is a change of referent as we move from verse 39 to verse 40. There are subtle indicators, such as the mention of the time of the end and the increased use of mythical materials, but we must be aware of the tenuousness of our interpretation and allow room for difference of opinion on this point of interpretation among those who affirm the truth of the Word of God. And so what he's saying there is, look, good conservative people can disagree on whether chapter 11 is talking about a future Antichrist figure, a Antiochus IV only, or whether it's talking about Antiochus IV and then a future Antichrist figure as well, right? And again, we're not going to decide that argument in here. And again, all of this is very complicated, but a lot of people will read this as though it only has to do with stuff that's still future yet. And I will say that clearly that is not the case, because again, it lines perfectly up. And again, if you want to read about that stuff, you would read 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which is in the Apocrypha. That tells the story about that. None of that is in the actual Bible, right? So basically you think of 1st and 2nd Maccabees as the history of that time period. You don't, and I don't consider it divinely inspired. It just tells you the history of that time period, just like you would use any other ancient historian, Herodotus, or anybody else. Okay, then in Daniel 12, you get the first and only mention of resurrection in the Old Testament. And just for the record, and I'm not saying that it's true, but this is another reason why critical scholars will say that Daniel is written in the 2nd century BC, because resurrection really doesn't get a big push until during that time period. But that doesn't mean that Daniel doesn't see, that that's going to happen. But at Daniel 12, 2 through 3, it says, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth," of course he's talking about death, "shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt," right? Well, that is a very specific, that sounds like New Testament, right? Like stuff. You don't get that anywhere else in the Old Testament, right? This is the one place. "And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever," okay? And so again, there's your one and only mention of resurrection in the Old Testament, but it's there and it's very clear, right? All right. Zechariah, okay, and we're going to go through several things in Zechariah and look at those. So what is the historical setting of Zechariah? When the people returned to, let me say this very quickly. So note that when he talked about he's fighting against the prince of Persia and then the prince of Greece will also come, that also goes into the discussion that we talked about last week of the 4 kingdoms. And we talked about whether Rome is the last kingdom or Greece is the last kingdom. Well, again, even in that passage, Greece is the last kingdom mentioned, right? It doesn't mention Rome specifically, or even alluding to it. And so it specifically says Greece. And so, again, that seems to bolster the argument that Greece is the 4th kingdom. When the people, note in Zechariah, when the people returned to Jerusalem under Persia, they were still under foreign rule. So even though they were allowed to go back to their homeland and rebuild the temple and worship their God, they still are under a world power. Morale is low, and so note that only about 50,000 people, and one commentator even said about 30,000 people, ended up going back and returning to their homeland. There was political turmoil in Persia, where you have infighting about who's going to be the emperor, right? Until Darius finally consolidates power and then he becomes the emperor. And so the Israelites believe, and all of the other client kingdoms who are under Persia, they believe, wait a minute, Persia's having all of this political turmoil. It looks like we might get to be an independent state again. If they fall apart, then there's nobody over us, right? Well, it turns out they do consolidate power under Darius, and so then they don't get what they thought they were going to get, and that's political independence. And note that the Israelites who have returned act just like the Israelites who got exiled. And so Zechariah is like, this is not good. Like, it turned out really bad for us the first time we did all this stuff. And mostly here, it's not so much about worshiping pagan gods as it was in the past, but also the problem of social issues, right? That seems to be more the problem after the exile. And again, that's judicial fairness, taking care of the poor, the widow, the fatherless, those types of people. So note that God raises up both Haggai, who starts about 2 months before Zechariah, and Zechariah for this time. And so Haggai, his role is to say, hey, we got to get the temple rebuilt, right? And Zechariah's message is, hey, the temple's going to be rebuilt. We need to get ourselves back into a spiritual place where we can come to the Lord and worship, right? So that we're prepared. So then you get to Zechariah, okay? And you've got the horse riders of Zechariah 1, okay? And so what is that all about? Note that this is somewhat of a model that the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in Revelation, they use a similar deal. And that comes basically from here. It says at Zechariah 1, 8 through 12, I saw in the night, and behold, a man riding on a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees in the glen, and behind him were red, sorrel, and white horses. And just for the record, each of those colors in Hebrew, it's saying that there are many of each of those colors. It's not saying there's one guy on each horse. It's saying there's many of each of these horses, but then there's the one man on the red horse, of course. Then I said, "What are these, my Lord?" The angel who talked with me said to me, "I will show you what they are." So the man who was standing among the myrtle trees answered, "These are they whom the Lord has sent to patrol the earth." And they answered, "The angel of the Lord." Notice it says, "The angel of the Lord." And this is going to be one of those times where, who have I always told you the angel of the Lord is? Mm-hmm. Who's the angel of the Lord? Mm-hmm. It's God. No, in the Old Testament, generally the angel of the Lord is God himself in human form. Because remember, the angel of the Lord shows up and he presents things like, "I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that." When he shows up to Abraham in Genesis 18, which y'all have worked on, you've got the angel of the Lord stands there and tells Abraham all the things that he's going to do for him, right? And so generally, it is God himself. And I've often given the caveat, or it is an angel who has the authority to speak for God, right? As though he is God. And so in this case, clearly this angel cannot be God because he prays to God, unless you wanted to make the argument that the angel of the Lord is always, if it's God in human form, it's always Jesus, pre-incarnate Jesus, and therefore you could say he's praying to the Father, but I don't think anything like that's in view, and I don't think in the Old Testament they would have had no understanding of that. Like that would have been like, what is going on, right? So it says, and they answered the angel of the Lord who was standing among the myrtle trees and said, "We have patrolled the earth, and behold, all the earth remains at rest." Then the angel of the Lord said, "O Lord of hosts," and notice it says, "O Yahweh of hosts, how long will you have no mercy on Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, against which you have been angry these 70 years?" Note that 70 years is the same 70 years that Daniel prayed about, that it would end so the people could go home. It's the same period of time that Jeremiah said they were going to be in exile. And it's the time period basically between Babylon and Persia. So the Babylonians are the ones who are seen to have exiled God's people for about 70 years, and then they're allowed to go back under Persia. So the man on the red horse seems to be the same as the man standing among the myrtles, which seems to be the same as the angel of the Lord. So that seems to be the same character, okay? The man on the red horse, the man standing among the myrtle trees, the angel of Yahweh, right? So then you have the interpreting angel, who's the one who speaks to Daniel, and then you have the other riders on the colored horses, right? So you have all that. So note, interestingly, and I thought this was fascinating, the background of the riders themselves is going to be the Persian postal system, okay? So one of the things that Darius instituted was a system of delivering messages and such. And so what he would do is he would have riders spread out every mile. And so, I'm sorry, not a mile, a day's ride, okay? So you would ride a day's ride with whatever you had, message or whatever. You'd go a day's ride, and then you would hit another rider. You'd give the message, then they would go a day's ride to the next. And so you had this continuous thing. Well, what they would do is this is a surveillance system also. And so they would be able to report back all of the things that they had seen to the Persian Empire, right? And so they would know what was going on. We have a description of it from Herodotus in his the Histories. It's called the Histories. And it says, while Xerxes did thus, he sent a messenger to Persia with news of his present misfortune. Now, there is nothing mortal that accomplishes a course more swiftly than do these messengers, by the Persians' skillful contrivance. It is said that as many days as there are in the whole journey, so many are the men and horses that stand along the road, each horse and man at the interval of a day's journey. These are stopped neither by snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness from accomplishing their appointed course with all speed. The first rider delivers his charge to the second to the third, and thence it passes on from hand to hand, even as in the Greek torchbearers race in honor of Hephaestus. So note, they do this, and obviously it sounds like the U.S. Postal Service, right? It's like they got it from Herodotus and the Persian messengers. And so they would go through, and so it would seem that this, and keep in mind, this is a vision, right? And so this vision seems to be of God's, and it's not necessarily literally the system, it's just saying God knows all the things that are happening in all places. And this is going to be a message of comfort for people who have been exiled in a foreign country. And they're like, well, God can't see us here because, again, gods are only powerful in their own nations. And we've talked about that many times, whether there are actual divine beings over them. That's the way they believed, was that gods are only powerful in their areas. And here Zechariah is saying, no, I saw it. God sees everything. He knows what's going on in Persia. He knows what's going on everywhere, right? And so it's comfort to these people who have been exiled. So it's God's eyes surveillance system, if you will. Note that the peace reported by the writers in this section, it talks about that all is at peace. Well, that seems to be the fact that Darius of Persia has consolidated all power. So that would be peaceful for Persia, and wars and stuff have stopped. But that's not good news for Israel, simply in the fact that they're still under foreign domination, right? Even though Persia is pretty good to Israel, they're still not their own people. I mean, listen, if there was some other foreign country that came in and took over the United States, but they were pretty nice to us, we wouldn't be like, they're nice, we'll live with it. No, right? You'd have everybody out with their guns and fighting back until the last man, right? What's the old movie, Red Dawn, right? You'd have a Red Dawn situation. Nobody laughed or made any comment. Am I the only person that knows Red Dawn? Surely not, right? I am the only person? Oh, I thought you were saying I was the only person. Oh. Okay. I was about to say, man, I know I'm a heathen and everything, but I thought, yeah, I did. It's funny because I never saw the second, the new one. I never even watched that one. I just remember the old one. So they won't be getting their freedom anytime soon. So note, so that's what those horses seem to represent. The horses in chapter 6, however, those horses pull chariots. And so what it seems to be saying there is that those horses are sent out by God, which really symbolize other nations, to subdue all of the other nations and such, right? And so, again, a message of hope that God has the power to go out and subdue these other nations who are fighting against Israel. So then somebody asked me, I think it was in my other class, they said, so in Zechariah 6, 5 through 6, there's no east, right? It talks about they send riders to the north, the west, and the south, but why do they not send riders east? Well, note, the east is the Arabian desert, right? And you don't send anybody directly to the east. You send them north, up through Mesopotamia, and then over, and then eventually south, and you end up east. However, you don't just hightail it east because there's lots of stuff that you don't want to have to deal with there. And so that seems to be the deal. If you wanted to travel to Babylon, which in view, this seems to be particularly Babylon that the chariots are going to defeat, because those are the people that have exiled God's people. So it seems like the chariots are going to go, and they're going to go to Babylon. So they would have to go up and over. So they would go north first. You have a measuring man at Zechariah 2. Sir?
We have to where the red horse goes.
Well, the red horse seems to be, so it has the other three. So the red horse seems to be in charge. He seems to be the general, if you will.
He's what's in charge.
Yeah, he's the one that tells everybody else where to go. Yeah. Note that in Zechariah 2, the man measuring, he is symbolically measuring Jerusalem for its rebuilding, right? They're going to rebuild the city, and they're going to rebuild the temple. And again, this is a message of hope for those people who have been exiled in Babylon, and their temple has been destroyed. And again, the point here is to give them hope that, listen, the city's going to be rebuilt, the temple's going to be rebuilt, you're going to be able to return home, it's coming. Then you get to Zechariah 3. It's like every chapter has like weird stuff. Like Zechariah is like lots of stuff. You have Satan and Joshua in Zechariah 3 at the throne of God, right? Zechariah 3, 1 through 4. So let me set it up for you first. So what you have is Joshua, who is the high priest, okay, or going to be the high priest. And he is symbolically here, like Zechariah is seeing this vision, where you have Joshua, the high priest. He is standing in for Israel. And Israel is bad. And they've been bad. And does Israel deserve destruction? Does Israel deserve destruction? Yes, absolutely. And so what this 4 verses here are going to be saying to us is that yes, they deserve condemnation. But God is going to use grace and he's going to save them anyway, right? And that when I say save, I mean he's going to bring them back and let the Israelites, his people, live back in the city and give them the opportunity to worship God and do the right thing. But you have this weird deal where Satan is involved. Also, before I get started, remember that Satan in the Old Testament is not a proper name. It is Ha-Satan. Ha means the, and Satan is Satan, okay? It is the Satan. And Satan means adversary, right? So it's the adversary. And so it is not necessarily, it's definitely not a proper name. It seems to be an office, right? So it says at Zechariah 3, 1 through 4. Then he showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord, right? Which in this case is God, right? So that's interesting that we just talked about the other, and here you have the angel of the Lord, who is God, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. So where is Satan? At the right hand of God, right? And so he's standing there to accuse Joshua, the high priest, who again is representing Israel, who has been bad. Does Joshua deserve to be accused? Absolutely. And the Lord said to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, O Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this a brand plucked from the fire?" What is a brand plucked from the fire? It is a stick that has been burning in a fire, and you take it out so that it doesn't burn up, right? And so that's what Israel is. Israel deserves to burn up, but God has reached in and he's going to take them out and he's going to allow them to survive. Is the adversary here wrong in saying that they deserve condemnation? No. Now Joshua was standing before the angel, clothed with filthy garments, which represents the sins of Israel. And the angel said to those who were standing before him, "Remove the filthy garments from him." And to him he said, "Behold, I have taken your iniquity away from you, and I will clothe you with pure vestments." And so again, grace. We have a picture of grace here. And you have Satan in the Old Testament role where he accuses God's people, but it seems to be that that's his job. And so again, we look at Job 1 and 2, where it says that the sons of God, who again, like we talked about before, are clearly angels or divine beings. It says they come to present themselves before God, and it says that Satan, the adversary, was with them. And then he and God strike up a conversation about Job, and then they end up in this deal. And again, remember, in chapter 2, when it talks about the adversary afflicting Job, God takes the credit for it. He says, it's not pushed, but it's something like that. You incited me against Job for no reason, right? And so it says God was the one who afflicted Job, whereas in chapter 1, it clearly says that Satan afflicted Job. And again, you have that common theme where God sent a divine being to attack Ahab, where God takes credit when divine beings go out and do stuff. And so again, this passage in Zechariah follows through that same idea that it would seem that in the Old Testament, there is an office for and you don't want that job, or it's a bad job, but where you accuse people, he's almost like a prosecutor, right? And so there you have it. Note in the New Testament, once you have Jesus, you're not guilty. And so there's no accusing you, because you can't be accused anymore because you have Jesus, and Jesus has covered all of your sins. And so Satan clearly loses access from heaven in chapter 12, where it talks about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. It is at that point, seemingly, according to Revelation 12, where Satan, who in the New Testament is absolutely a proper name, where Satan loses access to heaven. Okay. Note that the two lampstands in and the olive trees in Zechariah 4, the key to that symbolism is at 4:11 through 14, where it says, "Then I said to him, what are these two olive trees on the right and the left of the lampstand? And a second time I answered and said to him, what are these two branches of the olive trees, which are beside the two golden pipes from which the golden oil is poured? He said to me, do you not know what these are? I said, no, my Lord. Then he said, these are the two anointed ones who stand by the Lord of the whole earth." So you have two anointed ones who points to two people, and those two anointed ones are associated with the trees and the branches themselves. And so they are either Zerubbabel and Joshua, Zerubbabel being the governor, the earthly authority, the civil authority, and then Joshua, the high priest, or the religious authority. Or it could be referring to both Haggai and Zechariah, which we talked about. They're there to minister during this time period. It could be those two. So whichever one, it seems to be likely those are the specific reference of that passage. And then you have a woman in a basket in Zechariah 5. And I'm going to read through this kind of quickly. It says, "Then the angel who talked with me came forward and said to me, lift your eyes and see what this is that is going out." So he's like, hey, come look at this, right? And it's like, oh, that's weird, a woman in a basket. And I said, what is this? He said, this is the basket that is going out. And he said, this is their iniquity in all the land. And behold, the leaden cover was lifted, and there was a woman sitting in the basket. And he said, this is wickedness. And he thrust her back into the basket and thrust down the leaden weight on its opening. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and behold, two women coming forward. The wind was in their wings. They had wings like the wings of a stork. That's comical. And it's comical on purpose. And they lifted up the basket between earth and heaven. Then I said to the angel who talked with me, where are they taking the basket? He said to me, to the land of Shinar, to build a house for it. And when this is prepared, they will set the basket down there on its base. Does any of your translations have what the land of Shinar is? It's Babylon, right? So we're talking about Babylon, again, the place where we've been exiled all this time. And so what are we doing? It is the evil of Israel being removed and taken to Babylon in this place that we have been exiled to, right? And so it's saying, hey, listen, we're not doing this again. We're going to take this evil and we're going to leave that in Babylon, all right? Don't bring it back here, right? It's like when you say, you tell your kids, don't bring that in the house, right? We're not having that in the house. Well, we're not having this in Israel anymore, right? But interestingly, and again, this is one of those things that I came across that I was shocked in a commentator. Note, and it makes perfect sense, this whole passage here provides a parody of the Ark of the Covenant, right? So note that it has a cover of lead, which sounds like in Hebrew, strangely enough, mercy seat, which the mercy seat is on the Ark of the Covenant. The two cherubim atop the Ark are paralleled by the two women with stork wings. So you have these big cherubim animals with the big wings on the back of that make up the back of the throne of God. And here you have this woman taken off by some stork wing women, right? So again, that would have been funny to them. They would have been like, oh. Note that God is enthroned on the ark while the woman is under the cover of this deal, right? Stuck in it. And note that God is preparing to return to a newly rebuilt temple, whereas the sins of Israel in this woman going to Babylon, she is going to a temple that's being built for her in Babylon, right? So again, it's pretty fascinating stuff. Okay. So now what we're going to do. So we're going to summarize. And again, I give full credit to John Walton and Andrew Hill, who wrote a great, it's called A Survey of the Old Testament. I'm a big fan of John Walton, but this is one of the many surveys that I also use when I need a quick overview of a book. I'll give a shout out to John J. Collins also, because I also used his. So Esther, okay? The purpose of the book of Esther is to show that God can accomplish his purposes just as easily through coincidences as he can through grand miracles of deliverance. Though he works behind the curtain, he is just as much in control. Events that others see as chance of fate or fate can be seen by believers as signs of God's sovereignty. And interestingly, do you know an odd fact about Esther? Anybody?
God's not mentioned.
God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. All right? They pray and stuff, but God's name is not mentioned. Unless you read the Apocrypha that has the extra additions to Esther. And apparently whoever wrote those additions said, you know what? It's not right that God's not mentioned. So they mentioned God in the additions to Esther. Ezra and Nehemiah. The purpose of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah is to show the numerous ways that God was faithfully at work in restoring the people of Israel to their land after the Babylonian exile. God providentially brought favor with the Persian rulers and helped the Israelites overcome the obstacles presented by their enemies as they rebuilt the temple and walls of Jerusalem and established the law of Moses as the foundation of society, right? They go on to say, God's presence in Ezra and Nehemiah is implicit in the rebuilding and dedication of the second temple. The Israelites' understanding of the divine presence is also implicit in the community confession and covenant renewal ceremony and in the reforms of priesthood, Sabbath keeping, and the reorganization of post-exilic Judah around the Torah, the law of Moses, suggesting the need of the holiness of the people is still a requirement in view of God's covenant relationship with his people. Joel. Joel's concern throughout the book was to address the day of the Lord, and that's the day of judgment, both contemporary days of judgment against different nations, including God's own people, but also a future day of judgment where everybody will be judged and things will come to an end. I added all that. That wasn't part of the quote. The locust plague was the beginning, and the judgment would get worse. He called on the people to repent, and when they responded positively, favor and prosperity were proclaimed. Note that the locust plague is clearly fighters and horsemen, right? And so when you get to the New Testament, you get to Revelation. In Revelation 9, when you have these locusts, they're clearly, well, I won't say clearly, but they seem to be indicating Parthian warriors. And again, you'd have to look at the Revelation study for that. Malachi. The prophet calls post-exilic Israel to repentance for the purpose of covenant renewal with Yahweh. This will enable the priests and people of God to restore proper temple worship and practice social justice with the community. They go on to say God's presence is implicit in the book of Malachi in the prophet's rebuke of the people for insincere worship and improper animal sacrifice. The eschaton will see the Lord suddenly enter his temple in Jerusalem to judge the wicked and purify the righteousness. And note that 3:1, I did want to add in here because there's a connection that needs to be made. Malachi 3:1, and I won't read it, I'll just tell you, it promises a messenger who will come before the day of the Lord. And then in Malachi 4:5-6, it links that messenger with a return of Elijah. And note that the New Testament authors will interpret that as being fulfilled in John the Baptist. He is the one who comes and heralds the coming of the Messiah, right? And so somebody asked me in my other class, they said, what's the deal with the order of the book specifically in the New Testament? And so note, and we'll talk about it next week, but very quickly and we'll be done. So in the New Testament, you actually have, as far as the Gospels, you have Mark written first, you have Matthew and Luke written next, apart from each other, and then you have John written considerably later. Okay, so then why is Matthew first? Because Malachi, the last book in the Old Testament, it promises the coming of the Messiah, right? Matthew is the most Jewish of all the Gospels. And so the early compilers of the Bible, when they were putting the order of the books in, they said, what better transition to make between the Old Testament and the New Testament than the promise of the Messiah, or the Messianic age, if you will, in Malachi, and the heralding of the Jewish Messiah in Matthew. And so that's the reason those two books are put side by side, or we have that transition between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Then you have the Gospels, then you have Acts, you have the letters of Paul, you have the letters that aren't by Paul, and then you have the book of Revelation, right? And so, which ends it all out. And so that's, just for the record, that's the reason that the New Testament is organized the way that it is. All right? There's not like a special, like, it's not like trying to do it in any kind of chronological order. Like, I mean, it kind of does, but because you have the Gospels and Acts, that's chronological order, and then Revelation at the end would be kind of like chronological order, and then you have the letters, which are all throughout the time period of Acts and shortly after. All right, any questions or concerns? Ladies and gentlemen, we are done with the Old Testament. All right, and let me say, if you have gotten behind, which I think, I mean, and I don't mean this sarcastically, I think y'all have been pretty faithful in reading your Bible studies, or at least y'all come in with all kinds of great questions. Or if you know anybody who has gotten behind, please encourage them to get back on, because this next week is going to be the Gospels, and I did ask Zach to say it, and I think he said it in both services, that this is the perfect time to get back on the wagon, right? And go ahead and start reading with the Gospels. So I encourage you, if you have gotten behind, don't worry about that. Get in with the Gospels. And I think we're going to be in the Gospels for like 4 weeks. So that'll be good stuff. And so it will change a little bit, because it won't be, we've been in the prophets for so long, it's gotten very complicated, right? Now that we're back into something like more narratives, it's going to be a little more clear. It won't be nearly as complicated. Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.